Hello everyone, welcome to my channel. I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time are you watching? Now get comfortable and relax. Case 1. On the morning of Friday, October 3rd, 2003, 32-year-old Dave King had just left a gym in Hodgston when a white transit van slowed as it drove past. At that moment, the passenger of the vehicle leant out of the window and fired 26 rounds from an AK-47, 5 of which hit King, killing him instantly. A known drug dealer and violent enforcer, Dave Rolex King was part of a drug trafficking organization that was bringing in hundreds of thousands of pounds of heroin into the UK. But King's fate was sealed when his criminal associates suspected him of being a police informer and hatched a plan to eliminate him. The Essex Connection. During the 1990s, a small group of criminals ruled the drug scene around Essex and East London, flooding the streets and nightclubs with ecstasy and cocaine. This operation was run by 3 drug dealers, Tony Tucker, Pat Tate and Craig Rolfe, known collectively as the Essex Boys. It was during the early 1990s that Glaswegian gangster Dave King first came into contact with Tony Tucker, who at that time operated a North London shop selling muscle-building supplements. The two men bonded over a shared interest in bodybuilding and soon developed a friendship. At 6 feet 3 inches, the muscular King was an intimidating presence and was more than capable of handling himself in a violent situation. The two men worked together as minders for ex-WBC super middleweight boxing champion Nigel Benn and enjoyed the attention and access to celebrities that came with the job. Tucker also ran a lucrative security business that provided bouncers for clubs around Essex and East London, which netted him upwards of £1,500 a week. King earned himself a fearsome reputation as a good fighter working the doors, where the sale of drugs to nightclubbers was tightly controlled. During this time, King was sentenced to a prison term for violently assaulting a man in Stevenage and hiding his victim inside the boot of a car. During his time in prison, Tony Tucker was murdered along with his criminal associates Pat Tate and Craig Rolfe. The 3 men were found shot to death in a Range Rover that was parked down a small farm track in the village of Rettendon in Essex. Rolfe had been blasted in the side of the head, while Tucker's face had been obliterated. In the back seat, Pat Tate had been shot once in the stomach and twice in the head. This crime that became known as the Rettendon Murders. Canning Town Firm. Upon his release from prison, King joined up with another criminal organization, known as the Canning Town Firm. He became close friends with one of its members, Darren Pearson, a violent, crazed individual who was connected to dangerous football hooligan gangs. As described by former Essex boy gang member turned crime author Bernard O'Mahony, Pearman was a particularly violent individual. Darren Pearman was a member of the Canning Town Firm, probably the best little outfit in London. It was all part of the same group of people as the Inner City Firm, which was centered on the West Ham Fans gang. They were all very violent. If someone stamped on their foot, they got murdered. Darren was a space job. He wore cardigans and had his hair in a side parting. He looked like a boffin, but was a raging lunatic. He was friends with Dave King, and a couple of years ago, they were in Charlie Chan's nightclub. There was a fight in which a man was cut by a bottle of glass. The glassing kicked off a big fight, and the doorman got involved. One of them was an ex-wrestler called Ronnie Fuller. Ronnie didn't know the rules. If you're a doorman and you grab people like Pearman and King, you're going to get it as well, because they have to keep their front. It rumored, according to underworld sources, that 27-year-old Pearman's death was the result of an argument started by King at the Charlie Chan's North London nightclub, which ended with Ronnie Fuller, the then head doorman, forcibly ejecting both men from the establishment. Exactly 4 years to the day before his own death, King and Pearman were at the Epping Forest Country Club near Chigwell, Essex, when Pearman saw Fuller at the country club. A few weeks later, they clashed with him again outside Epping Forest Country Club, said O'Mahony. Sources state that the row stemmed from a dispute Pearman and Fuller were having over a girl, and there had been a previous fight in which Fuller had gotten the better of Pearman. Another fight soon broke out. According to eyewitnesses, Pearman's gang attacked Mr. Fuller with weapons, including a machete. This had been hidden in a sofa inside the club. During the scuffle, Fuller wrestled the weapon from Pearman, who sustained fatal injuries. O'Mahony said, Pearman was stabbed and pronounced dead by the time he rolled up to Whipps Cross Hospital in the back of a cab. Pearman's brother was also injured. Several months later, Fuller and an associate were released on police bail over the Pearman murder. On August 29, 2000, Fuller was blasted to death on the doorstep of his home by a hitman riding a motorbike. O'Mahony said, later, a motorbike hitman shot Ronnie twice in the head and 3 times in the chest, killing him outside his home in Grays, Essex, in front of his wife. According to O'Mahony, the Canning Town firm had refused to cooperate with the police investigation into Pierman's murder and announced they would sort it themselves. Ronnie Fuller had moved roughly 20 miles from Loughton, but as O'Mahony put it, it had not been nearly far enough. No one was ever tried for the murder of Ronnie Fuller. According to a police source, investigators suspected the Pierman's father, Christopher Pierman, was behind the killing in retribution for the death of his son. It was later revealed that at the time of the Pierman murder, the Epping Forest Country Club was owned by David Hunt, who is considered one of the most violent gangsters in the United Kingdom, and suspected head of the criminal organization known as the Hunt Syndicate. According to a former member of the Canning Town firm, King's presence within the gang resulted in bitter feuds. John Rawlinson said that King had angered many with his attitude. He joined up with our firm after coming out of prison, much against my better judgment. Once he did, he systematically began to turn everybody against each other, and caused a lot of bad feeling. Once former associate said of King, he was a nice fella in his own way, but you wouldn't want to get on the wrong side of him, while another said, he was a violent bully. Rolex Dave. Police investigations linked King to the lucrative London trade in stolen watches, something that earned him the sobriquet Rolex Dave. King was rumored to sell the stolen watches to the Bratva, or Russian mafia. Around this time, King began forming connections with other criminal groups. King eventually started his own nightclub in Stevenage called the Renaissance. It became known as a notorious center for drug dealing and was closed by the local council for non-payment of rent in 2002. One bar manager in the town said, it was a drugs haven. It was full of them. By the early 2000s, he expanded his criminal activities that included handling stolen property and drug dealing, and had begun trafficking large quantities of drugs into the United Kingdom. This lucrative but highly dangerous business had netted him hundreds of thousands in illicit profit, but also many enemies within the underworld. So lucrative was the drug trafficking business that King lived in a £554,000 home at Ardleigh, Herts, financed through his drug dealing and criminal activities. But Rolex Dave King knew the dangers he faced, and this was the reason why he took precautions wherever he went. One particular incident had caused King to suspect his life was in danger. In June 2002, a heroin shipment was intercepted by customs. A relatively common occurrence, however, this shipment was worth £100,000. King and 4 of his criminal associates were arrested over the 14 kilograms drug seizure. All 5 were charged with drug offenses, however proceedings against King, by then a father of 2, were dropped at an early stage. This prompted one of his co-defendants to shout in court that he was a grass, and soon caused a fallout within the criminal gang. His gangland associates had been harboring fears for some months that their firm had been infiltrated by a police or customs grass, and the ease with which King had got off pointed the finger towards him, said Detective Inspector Paul Maggie of Essex Police. D.I. Maggie said, "This is a tit-for-tat killing. King knew he had a problem, that there was a threat to his life. King took a contract out on Sharma. David Sharma, a one-time friend of King from North London, was so frightened of 6 feet 3 inches, 18 SD King, that he fled to Caen in the south of France, and went into hiding under a false identity. When 2 of the other men arrested in the drug seizure along with King and Sharma, Roger Vincent and David Smith, heard about the threat to Sharma, they offered to have King shot in retaliation. Police said that was the motive for King's murder. Vincent from Penn, Bucks, and Smith, who lived in Borehamwood, Herts, contracted armed robber Dean Spencer from Manchester to carry out the hit. 31-year-old Smith armed himself with a Webley .38 pistol, loaded with 5 bullets, and went with another man to King's Stevenage home on September 22, 2003. They became convinced King was waiting for them, and knew his reputation for ruthlessness along with his powerful physique as a bodybuilder that earned him the nickname Muscles. As they suspected, King had been forewarned about a possible threat to his, and was with minder Ian Crocker. During this time, he had also taken to wearing a bulletproof vest. Outside King's home, the 4 men were locked in a standoff before Spencer lost his nerve and fled. Having pulled out of the deal, Roger Vincent became violent when he found he would have to do the job himself. Spencer was later arrested for committing an armed robbery, and under questioning told detectives about the murder plot against King. During his later trial at Luton Crown Court, it was learned he told investigators, "When I saw how big he was and wearing that bulletproof vest, I knew my little gun would be useless against him." The assassination. When Vincent, a 33-year-old gangland debt collector and fixer, heard that Spencer had bottled out, he decided to take matters into his own hands. He enlisted the help of 33-year-old David Smith, who was to act as his driver and also assist with the murder. Aware that King knew about the murder plot against him, and that he routinely took to wearing a bulletproof vest, the two men got a Hungarian-made Kalashnikov AKS-47 machine gun and loaded it with full metal jacket, armor-piercing bullets. The AKS-47, an AK-47 with a folding metal stock, is issued mainly to paratroopers and members of elite special forces. The detailed planning that followed was conducted over mobile phones, and evidence from bills was used by the police to piece together the movements and motives of the main players. With forensic evidence left by the killer, CCTV recordings, descriptions of the suspects from witnesses, surveillance and recording of conversations, police were able to put together a profile of the murder, which was later presented to the court at the trial of Vincent and Smith. Vincent and Smith used a stolen white transit van and a stolen Mercedes as getaway cars, and proceeded to stalk King until they saw their chance to kill him. This came on October 3, 2003, when Dave King left the Physical Limits Gym in Brewery Road, Hoddesdon, Hertfordshire, in the company of his bodyguard, Ian Crocker. As the two men walked outside, a white van, driven by Smith, pulled up alongside King. In that moment, he must have realized what was about to happen. Sitting in the passenger seat, Vincent opened fire on King with an AK-47 Kalashnikov assault rifle, discharging at least 26 rounds of armor-piercing ammunition. In what was described in court as a classic drive-by assassination, King was struck at close range by 5 rounds from the 3-second burst that hit him in the chest, arm, and leg. He died instantly. Other rounds peppered King's car, others his friend Ian Crocker, and others were later found in the walls of the gym. Dead Ince Maggie said, "Some of the bullets that hit the gym went through the wall and into the gym. It was the first time that weapon was used in Britain in automatic mode." The killers then made their getaway, torching the vehicles to cover their tracks. The investigation. However, the killers failed to adequately discard of crucial evidence linking them to the crime. Close to the burnout van, police found a discarded plastic glove. Inside was a palm print of David Smith. The day following the murder, a couple were walking beside Braid-on Water at Great Yarmouth on the Norfolk Broads. Suddenly they spotted a man hurling a red sports bag into the water, before hurriedly running away. The walkers retrieved the holdall, and inside found it contained an AKS-47 assault rifle and spare rounds of ammunition. Police were able to prove the gun, which had previously belonged to the Hungarian prison authorities, was the same one used to kill Dave King. Further evidence was recovered from the murder weapon. On the lip of the curved ammunition clip they found a trace of Smith's DNA. Meanwhile, on a towel in the same bag, forensic officers found saliva DNA from Vincent, definitively linking him to the crime. Yet further evidence was uncovered on another towel that was found to contain fibers from a unique jute rug, which was at a flat used by Vincent. CCTV footage recovered by investigators placed Smith, wearing a distinctive hat, at a filling station in Hoddesdon. Mobile phones transmissions from Hoddesdon to King analyzed by police minutes after the shooting indicated that Vincent and Smith had called David Sharma to tell him they had murdered King. Sharma, who was wanted for his involvement in the King slaying, disappeared and was being actively hunted across Europe by Interpol. A fourth man, 38-year-old Julian Elfies, 38, from High Wycombe, Bucks, was convicted of assisting an offender, when it was proved he had helped Vincent lie low after the shooting. Arrested shortly after the killing, Vincent boasted to detectives under questioning that he made £250,000 in cash every year from a string of clubs he controls in the east of England. Vincent, who drove a £100,000 convertible Aston Martin DB7, was charged with King's murder. Assets worth £1.6 million were frozen by court order on the grounds that his funds were linked to drug trafficking and money laundering. The assets included his house in Hertfordshire, £1 million property in London, and £7,500 in 4 bank accounts. A detective said, "Whenever we talked to anyone in the underworld about Vincent, we discovered people were terrified of him. He is not a big man physically, but but has a fearsome reputation for violence and as a hired gun. For his part in the murder plot, father of four Vincent was sentenced to serve at least 30 years. His criminal associate and getaway driver David Smith was sentenced to a minimum of 25 years for his part in the murder. Elfies was jailed for 5 years for assisting Vincent, while Dean Spencer admitted conspiracy to murder King and was sentenced at a later date. After they were convicted, Mr. Justice Wilkie said, "This was a thoroughly planned, ruthless, and brutally executed assassination of a criminal by a small team. It was committed in a public street during daytime and involved an automatic firearm. It was only by great fortune that no other passers-by were seriously injured or worse." The murder of Dave King had been orchestrated as part of a plot to eliminate him before he managed to kill David Sharma. The two killers were friends with Sharma and offered to wipe out King purely as a favor with no payment involved. Rolex Dave King was a dangerous individual, known for his violent tendencies and criminal activities. However, not everyone remembers him for the crimes he committed. His parents, Jimmy and Norma King, remember their Glasgow-born son as a football-crazy family man. In a statement after his death, they said, "He was ambitious for himself and for his family and wanted the very best for his children." A devout Muslim, David's bodybuilding formed a great part of his lifestyle. He was proud of his appearance and a perfectionist in all that he did. The violent death of Dave King came as a shock to the community in Hoddesdon, but in the criminal underworld, rivalries and killings are not uncommon. Despite this, a police source said, "Whatever someone's past, no one deserves to be killed like this." But it was the way of the world he operated in. Case 2. The story of Pat Tate is one of violence, drug dealing, and murder that continues to intrigue and fascinate decades after the case of the Rettendon murders, in which Tate's gang, the Essex Boys, were found blasted to death in a Range Rover. But who was Pat Tate, and how did he end up living a life of crime? Considered by one of his victims as a bully who deserved what he got, the fate of Pat Tate was inexorably linked to that of his fellow Essex Boys, who would meet their demise on a freezing and desolate country lane. Pat Tate lived a violent life, and naturally came to a violent end. But how he came to become associated with the Essex Boys, a drug-dealing group who controlled the flow of drugs in Essex, can be answered by the then-growing drug trade in the UK. Born on August 7, 1958 in Rockford, Essex, Patrick "Pat" Tate seemed to have a penchant for violence. By the time of death at the age of 37, Tate, who was 6 feet 2 and weighed 18 stone, often used his size and immense strength to intimidate anyone who stood in his way. Tate had an extensive criminal record, including convictions for drug offenses and armed robbery, and had once escaped from a courthouse at Billericay. On December 30, 1988, the 30-year-old Tate made a dramatic escape from the dock. Accused of robbery and possession of cocaine, bodybuilder Tate stood before the court. He suddenly lunged at 3 police officers, who were injured, as he powered his way out of the court towards a waiting motorcycle driven by an accomplice. One WPC received a black eye in the altercation, and another officer was kicked in the face as police tried to block Tate's escape. According to police, witnesses inside the courtroom tried to impede the police attempts to restrain Tate. In the aftermath, roadblocks were set up but failed to trap Tate, who, sporting several tattoos and wearing a fawn top, light blue jeans, and a green sweatshirt. Tate subsequently fled to Spain, but was soon extradited back when he made the mistake of going to Gibraltar. Sentenced to 7 years imprisonment, Tate spent his time inside bodybuilding. By this time he had started taking drugs. With his already violent disposition, Tate fueled his anger with drugs. According to Bernard O'Mahony, a former member of the Canning Town firm, Tate suffered from a drug problem. Tate had a real drug addiction, he said. Upon his release on parole, he survived an attempt on his life when a hitman threw a brick through his bathroom window and shot him in the arm. Tate was rushed to hospital, and staff found he had hidden a stash of drugs and a handgun under his pillow. His license was immediately revoked, and he was sent back to prison. One man, Stephen Ellis, was questioned over the assault, but soon fled to the West County under a new identity where he took to wearing body armor out of fear of reprisals. His second-hand car business was looked after by his friend Tony Tucker, who gave him a job in his operation upon his release from prison. Tucker was running a drugs franchise operation and offered Pat Tate a position. By this time, Tate had a 2-year-old son, Jack Tate, with his girlfriend Sarah Saunders, who herself suffered violence at the hands of her partner. It was known to police that Tate domestically abused his girlfriend, and the couple split not long after his release from prison. O'Mahony said, "Look at Tate. He came out after 6 or 7 years inside, and within 5 months he was shot. 6 weeks after that, he was shot dead. 6 months he'd been out, and he was shot twice. I'm 60 and I've never been shot." O'Mahony said, "Look at Tate. He came out after 6 or 7 years inside, and within 5 months he was shot. 6 weeks after that, he was shot dead. 6 months he'd been out, and he was shot twice. I'm 60 and I've never been shot." Tate was described by his own mother as a liability who was often high on drugs, which made him paranoid and unpredictable. The night before he was murdered at Rettendon, Tate had telephoned the London Pizza Company in Basildon. He aggressively demanded a specially made pizza with 4 different toppings on each quarter. The manager, 21-year-old Roger Ryle, was busy and annoyed by the caller's attitude and so promptly hung up. Within minutes, Tate turned up at the store. There he picked up the till and smashed it against the wall, then punched Ryle and smashed his head into a glass plate on the sink of the bathroom. Ryle, like many others who encountered Tate, refused to press charges. One associate said of Tate, "A room would darken when he entered it." Another ex-girlfriend of Tate's is Lizzie Fletcher. She provided statements about Tate's behavior on the evening before his murder, offering insights into his activities and state of mind during that time. On the morning of December 7, 1995, Ken Jiggins and his friend, Farmer Peter Theobald, came across a metallic blue Range Rover, parked in front of a locked gate on Workhouse Lane in the small village of Rettendon, Essex. Initially, the 2 men suspected the seemingly sleeping occupants might be poachers. However, as they neared, they could see that 2 men inside were dead. While Jiggins phoned police, Theobald got a closer look and saw that another man was dead in the back seat. At around 8:30 a.m. that morning, Detective Superintendent Ivan Dibley received a telephone call that a triple murder had been committed. A 40-strong squad descended on the crime scene that cold winter morning, which had been a regular spot for courting couples. The passenger was identified as Tony Tucker, Pat Tate's 38-year-old friend and business partner. He suffered a catastrophic facial injury caused by a shotgun blast that almost completely obliterated his features. In the driver's seat was 26-year-old Craig Rolfe, the 3rd member of the firm known as the Essex Boys, who had also been hit by a shotgun blast to the side of his face, leaving a large hole in the side of his head. Taken by surprise, he still had his foot on the brake pedal. The man in the back seat was Pat Tate, his head smashed through the back window after he was shot once in the head and once in the stomach. It had all the hallmarks of a cold-blooded execution, and none of the victims had time to react. Detectives began to piece together the sequence of events and determine whether the killer or killers had been seated in the Range Rover with the victims, or had ambushed the men from outside the vehicle, blasting them to death before they realized what was happening. Det Superintendent Dibley said, "This is not an ordinary murder. It looks as if they were enticed down there. As far as murders go, you don't get any more serious than this." The killer fired off 8 rounds, leaving the spent cartridges where they fell, possibly because it was too dark to retrieve them. 3 shots were fired off in quick succession, killing Rolfe, then Tucker. It was surmised that before he could react, Tate was shot in the abdomen. The gunman then reloaded the shotgun, before shooting him twice in the head, and for good measure then fired another shot each into the already dead Tucker and Rolfe. It was strongly suspected that Tate had been the prime target. The others were merely collateral damage. A post-mortem examination found Pat Tate had a combination of cocaine, heroin and cannabis in his bloodstream, along with steroids. Investigators began looking for potential leads that might explain why these 3 men, who were considered low-level criminals, were apparently lured to late-night rendezvous where they were ambushed and shot to death. Detectives soon learned there were many reasons why certain people might want to cause harm to the 3 Essex boys. Tate in particular had made many enemies because of his violent manner, use of force, and explosive temper. Bernard O'Mahony said, "It was obvious to everyone who knew them what was going to happen. I was aware of it at the time and kept my distance. It wasn't hard." Several instances, in the months and years leading up to the Rettendon murders, were possible contributors to their deaths. Pat Tate and the Essex boys were suspected in the death of 28-year-old Kevin Whitaker, who died from an apparent drug overdose in November 1994. Whitaker was apparently murdered because of an alleged drug debt, and Tate's mother said her son told her this when she visited him in hospital after he was shot. Whitaker was found on November 17, 1994, 30 hours after going missing, his body dumped by the roadside. First indications were he died from an apparent drug overdose. It was Pat Tate's mother who began to make allegations, claiming that Tucker and Rolfe had injected Whitaker with a drug that caused his death. Marie Tate strongly believes her son was the innocent party in the crime, and that Whitaker's friends had taken revenge by killing her son and his criminal associates. However, detectives were certain it had no connection to their own murders at Workhouse Lane. Another death associated with the Essex boys was that of 18-year-old Leah Betts. The teenager, a schoolgirl from Latchington in Essex, was admitted to hospital on November 11, 1995 after falling into a coma. This occurred 1 month before the murders at Rettendon. It was found she had 4 hours previously taken an ecstasy, MDMA, tablet, and then drank approximately 7 liters of water during a 90-minute period. 5 days later she died after her life support machine was switched off. Her death was used in the British media as an example of the dangers of illegal drugs, and ecstasy in particular, something that had become common in nightclubs in Essex. In response, Essex police launched a large inquiry to locate the suppliers of the tablet Leah Betts had taken. They were able to pinpoint Raquel's club as the venue where it was bought. The subsequent investigation cost roughly £300,000. This inquiry resulted in the arrest of 4 of Leah's friends who had been present at the house. It has been suggested that Tony Tucker and Pat Tate's gang controlled the supply of ecstasy in the Basildon nightclub where the tablet had been bought. This led to the theory that the murders of the Rettendon drug dealers were revenge for the death of Leah Betts. In May 1996, a break in the case was made when 3 men were arrested during a police and customs drugs operation. 52-year-old Michael Steele, 33-year-old Jack Hooms, and a 3rd man were arrested and held on suspicion of importing drugs. These 3 men were soon linked to the Rettendon murders of Pat Tate, Tucker, and Rolfe. Facing a murder charge, one of the men, Darren Nichols, started to confess the role he played in their deaths. Nichols claimed to have met Steele, Hooms, and Tate a few years earlier while serving a prison sentence for distributing counterfeit currency at Hollesley Bay Prison in Suffolk. Upon his release, Nichols joined Steele's smuggling organization, making trips to Amsterdam. Michael Steele was considered a sophisticated Essex drug smuggler, and in November 1995, he supplied a consignment of cannabis with a street value of around £350,000 to Tate, Tucker, and Rolfe. This is considered the catalyst for the subsequent Rettendon murders. It turns out the quality of the drugs were so poor that Steele agreed to take back the cannabis and return a deposit of around £70,000. The money was paid, but Tate denied getting it and also failed to return 1/3 of the drugs haul. When Steele protested, Tate threatened to shoot him after making him beg on his knees. A furious Tate boasted he would kill the smuggler in revenge for the incident, and Steele, who had developed a close relationship with Tate's ex-girlfriend, who told him of the threats and caused him to make the first move. 6 weeks before the murders, Steele contacted Nichols and asked him to get him a gun. Shortly after, Pat Tate, Tucker, and Rolfe were invited to look at the farmer's field where, as part of their smuggling operation, the alleged drug plane would land. Nichols told police what happened next. As Rolfe's Range Rover approached the locked gate at the bottom of Workhouse Lane, Steele jumped out to open it. At the same moment, Jack Hooms, known as Steele's right-hand man, leant in with a pump-action shotgun and began blasting the 3 men inside. Moments later, Nichols was called by Hooms, asking to pick them up. As the 2 men got into the back of his car, he noticed they were spattered in blood and realized what had happened. Steele apparently said, "They want fuck with us again." When Pat Tate was found blasted to death alongside his fellow Essex boys, Tony Tucker and Craig Rolfe, arrangements were made by his family to lay him to rest. In January 1997, his flower-decked horse-drawn carriage led his coffin towards the Pitsea Church steps where the vicar waited to carry out the service. Police directed traffic as a bell tolled for the 25-minute service, during which a brother gave a touching tribute. One floral tribute said simply, "Daddy." Another card read, "Thanks for the good times. I will never forget you, your baby son Jordan." Roughly 60 mourners, close family and friends of the dead man sang, "All things bright and beautiful," and recited the 23rd Psalm, "The Lord is my shepherd." Pat Tate's headstone displays all the ostentation of his funeral service and carries a photograph of him. It reads, "Treasured memories of Pat Terrence Tate, who departed this life on December 6, 1995, aged 37. Loving father, loyal friend and brother, missing your smiles and generous heart. Your presence will never leave us. Now you walk with the angels looking down from God's great kingdom. Until we meet again, God bless, we will never forget you. On its base, two white doves are seen comfort each other, and the back of the memorial reads, God found the path was growing rough, the hill too steep to climb, so he closed your eyelids and whispered peace be thine. Pat Tate's funeral was befitting for the man who saw himself as a gangster, with the pomp and ceremony that he would have appreciated. Nichols said Steele went on to say he felt like an angel of death, because he felt he had done everyone a favor by getting rid of these three men. I think I knew all along that they were going to do it. With Nichols turning Supergrass, Michael Steele and Jack Hooms went on trial in late 1997 based on his testimony. Charged with murder, Nichols said he had little choice but to help the investigation and point the finger of blame at his former friends. The trial lasted 4.5 months, and the court proceedings were believed to have cost well over £1 million. Hooms and Steele's lawyers claimed Nichols had fabricated his story. On January 20th, 1998, the jury started deliberation for 4.5 days. When they returned, guilty verdicts for both defendants were handed down. The weight of evidence had been mobile phone records used to corroborate the informant's testimony, the reliability of which were raised afterwards. Michael Steele and Jack Hooms were convicted of the 3 murders and given triple life sentences. Darren Nichols was placed in the Witness Protection Program, with new identities for him and his family. The murders of Pat Tate, his boss Tony Tucker, and their fellow Essex boy Craig Rolfe have influenced several movies about their time as one of the criminal gangs supplying drugs and exploits as dangerous hard men in the Essex criminal underworld. Case 3. On the evening of December 6, 1995, a group of young men arrived at a small farm located in the village of Rettendon in Essex. The group were headed by Tony Tucker, a businessman who provided security for clubs around Essex, who along with his associates was involved in drug dealing. By the morning, all 3 would be dead, blasted to death inside their Range Rover in what would become known as the Rettendon murders. The investigation into Tucker's death, and those of his fellow Essex boys, as the group were known, would take many years before a Supergrass came forward with information on what happened that fateful night, and why the 3 men were murdered. After the conviction of the killers, doubt still lingers over who exactly pulled the trigger. Little is known of Tucker's early life and childhood. However, what is known is that he held aspirations from a young age of being a tough guy, someone who could hold their own in a fight and who people came to fear. With a taste for expensive things, Tucker strove to get what he wanted in life, even if that meant acquiring it through illegal means. As the leader of the Essex Boys, the drug-dealing gang who operated throughout Essex during the 1990s, Anthony "Tony" Tucker was a feared figure in the criminal underworld. He operated a security business that provided personnel for clubs around Essex. It was through this line of work that Tucker came to meet boxer Nigel Benn. A bodybuilder who regularly frequented the gym, Tucker started acting as a bodyguard for Benn, alongside minder David "Rolex Dave" King. This provided Tucker with the opportunity of meeting other celebrities, ensuring the expansion of his business. He was often seen at ringside during Benn's fights, as part of his entourage. A close associate of Pat Tate, another violent Essex criminal, who spent time in prison for drug offenses and robbery. Although the pair were known for their violence, they held a measure of respect for one another. While Tate was in prison, his second-hand car business was run by his friend Tucker, who then gave Tate a job upon his release. Known for his large physical presence and violent temper, Tate was instrumental in Tucker's drugs franchise operation. Other members of Tucker's new drugs venture included Craig Rolfe, a petty criminal with a heavy cocaine habit, who acted as muscle and driver to his boss Tucker, and Carlton Leach, a former football hooligan connected with the intercity firm, who worked as a bouncer at Essex nightclubs, becoming involved in the large-scale ecstasy dealing during the rave era of the later 1980s. It was the Tucker/Tate partnership that ensured the Essex Boys' eventual dominance over the drug trade. There were few who could stand up to their combined strength, and very often the opposition were too intimidated to defy the pair. Together they handed out punishment beatings to keep people in line, and frequently used torture against anyone who crossed them. The flow of drugs from the gang into nightclubs throughout Essex earned the Essex Boys hundreds of thousands in illicit revenue. Most of that money went on to fund the lifestyles of Tucker, Tate, Rolfe, and Leach. Although Tucker earned around £1,500 a week from his security business, he and his associates were soon enjoying lavish lifestyles. At the time of his death, Tucker was living in a £250,000 house and driving expensive cars. The sale of ecstasy pills funded the gang's drug empire. However, it proved fatal for those who consumed the deadly drug. 1 month before the deaths of the Essex boys, schoolgirl Leah Betts, from Latchington in Essex, was admitted to hospital on November 11, 1995 after falling into a coma. Only hours previously, the 18-year-old had taken an ecstasy, MDMA, tablet, and then drank approximately 7 liters of water during a 90-minute period. 5 days later she died after her life support machine was switched off. Although 4 of her friends who had present were arrested, no one was ever charged with supplying the deadly drug. Her death was used in the British media as an example of the dangers of illegal drugs, and ecstasy in particular. In response, Essex police launched a large inquiry to locate the suppliers of the tablet Leah Betts had taken. Leah had bought the tablet from Raquel's Club, a Basildon nightclub, where Tucker's gang allegedly controlled the supply of ecstasy. On the morning of December 7, 1995, 2 men discovered a seemingly abandoned Range Rover, parked in front of a locked gate leading to an angler's carp pond near the shooting area on the land of farmer Ken Jiggins, in the small village of Rettendon. That cold December morning was frosty, however the windshield of the vehicle was clear. When Jiggins and his friend Peter Theobald got closer, they could see 2 men in the driver and passenger seats. Thinking the men were asleep, they went to inspect and found the 2 men, and a third in the back seat, all dead. The 2 men called police, who arrived shortly to seal off the crime scene and preserve evidence. Detective Superintendent Ivan Dibley was soon on the scene, and the task of identifying the 3 men was the top priority. Each of the victims had been shot twice in the head with what appeared to be a 3-round pump-action 12-bore shotgun. The passenger had suffered a particularly brutal shot to the side of the face, while the passenger had received a direct hit to the back of the head, which obliterated the lower half of his face. The passenger was soon identified as 38-year-old Tony Tucker, while the other 2 were found to be 26-year-old Craig Rolfe in the driver's seat and 37-year-old Pat Tate in the back seat, who had suffered a shot to the stomach before being hit twice in the head. Police knew each of the victims as local hardmen and small-time gangsters. All 3 were known drug dealers with criminal records, who used their physical strength to intimidate and cause fear to their enemies. And these men had many enemies in their line of work. For all intents and purposes, it appeared to be a gangland reprisal. Det Superintendent Dibley said, "This is not an ordinary murder. It looks as if they were enticed down there. As far as murders go, you don't get any more serious than this." The killer fired off 8 rounds, leaving the spent cartridges where they fell, possibly because it was too dark to retrieve them. It is possible the killings had been a professional hit, because 2 of the victims died within 2 seconds, while the third, the backseat passenger Pat Tate, had possibly witnessed what happened to his 2 companions and attempted to escape, but was killed soon afterwards. After the murders were announced in the press, there was little outpouring of grief, except from the families and friends of the deceased, with many suggesting the 3 men had gotten what they deserved. Professional boxer Nigel Benn said of his death, "I have known him since I came out of the army. It is very tragic." D.S. Dibley said, "The public aren't too happy either about so much time being spent on such lowlife. But my job isn't to moralize. The killers have to be caught. There has been no tit for tat yet, and it has surprised me a little." None of the families of the dead men cooperated with police inquiries, and Dibley believed they had a good idea who committed the murders, but were scared. The number of suspects in the Rettendon murders, which the murders of Tony Tucker and his associates became known, is long and varied. Owing to the animosity towards the 3 men, the lead detective said, this was not a whodunit, but a whodidn't. One line of inquiry concerned the death of Leah Betts, and whether or not the murders had been retribution for the death of the teenager. One arrest was made, that of a 27-year-old decorator from South London, who was held during a joint operation with Scotland Yard and charged with firearms offences. D.S. Dibley said, "I'm happy with how our inquiry is proceeding, and I'm hopeful of arrests before I retire. It's how I would want to end a 32-year career." One theory concerned the North London Adams crime family. Essex police received information on January 1, 1996, from a detective from Exeter CID, who phoned in and said he had an underworld contact who believed he knew why the 3 men were killed. The subsequent report said, he has contact with a person who has a good connection with the drugs world in the London and Kent areas. The contact has stated that they were shot because they owe the firm £60,000 pounds. The document added, he has lots of phone inquiries in hand, which say can be connected with our murder inquiry. The man, who was 36 at the time, was described as a doorman/bodybuilder type and an associate of the Adams crime family. It wasn't until May 1996 that a break was made in the case. 3 men were arrested during a police and customs drugs operation. 52-year-old Michael Steele, 33-year-old Jack Hooms, and a third man were arrested and held on suspicion of importing drugs. Through dedicated police work, a link was made between the 3 men and the murders of the Essex boys. Facing a murder charge, the third man, convicted fraudster Darren Nichols, began confessing to police his role in the murders. He claimed to have met Steele, Hooms and Tate a few years earlier while serving a prison sentence for distributing counterfeit currency at Hollesley Bay Prison in Suffolk. Upon his release, Nichols joined Steele's smuggling organization, making trips to Amsterdam. While there, Nichols purchased hundreds of kilos of cannabis on behalf of Steele and Hooms, which he then drove to the Belgian coast. From there he would meet up with Steele's speedboat, and the drugs were then taken across the channel and deposited on the Essex coast, where they would be distributed later. The mastermind of this operation, Mick Steele, was described as a sophisticated Essex drug smuggler. He soon became involved with the Essex boys. In November 1995, he supplied a consignment of cannabis with a street value of around £350,000 to Tate, Tucker, and Rolfe. But the quality was so poor that Steele agreed to take back the cannabis and return a deposit of around £70,000. The money was subsequently paid. However, Tate denied getting it and also failed to return 1/3 of the drugs haul. When Steele protested, Tate threatened to shoot him after making him beg on his knees. Animosity had already developed between the 2 men after Steele had started a close relationship with Tate's ex-girlfriend. A furious Tate boasted he would kill the smuggler in revenge, and when Steele heard of the threats and decided to make the first move, on the pretense of making amends, Steele offered Tate a share in a lucrative cocaine deal he was involved in with his friend Jack Hooms. But Steele was secretly plotting the Essex boys' demise. 6 weeks before the murders, Steele contacted Nichols and asked him to get him a gun. He said Jack had a couple, but they didn't want to use those, and so Nichols said he asked a few people but failed to come up with anything. Tate, Tucker, and Rolfe were invited to look at the farmer's field where the alleged drug plane would land. Nichols went on to claim that when Rolfe's Range Rover approached the locked gate at the designated spot, located at the bottom of Workhouse Lane, Steele jumped out to open it. At the same moment, Jack Hooms, who acted as Steele's right-hand man, leaned in with a pump-action shotgun and began blasting the 3 men inside. Mere seconds later, Nichols got a call from Hooms on his mobile asking him to pick the 2 men up. He said it was only when they climbed into the back of his car, spattered in blood, that he realized what had happened. In his testimony, Nichols claimed that during the journey home, Steele had said, "They want fuck with us again." Fearing he would become an accessory to the murders, Nichols continued to sell drugs on Steele's behalf, but decided to come forward with information on the killings after he received threats from Steele. In late 1997, the 2 men went on trial charged with the murders of Tony Tucker, Pat Tate, and Craig Rolfe. On January 20, 1998, the jury at the Old Bailey deliberated the evidence for 4.5 days before returning guilty verdicts for both men. The weight of evidence had been mobile phone records used to corroborate the informant's testimony, the reliability of which were questioned only afterwards. Mick Steele and Jack Hooms were given triple life sentences. Darren Nichols was placed in the Witness Protection Program, given a new identity along with his family. Even now, Nichols has said he fears revenge for breaking the criminal code and ratting on his friends. Subsequently, a £250,000 price was put on his head. The dark history of the Rettendon murders is forever tied to the Blue Range Rover. But where is the Rettendon Range Rover now? Nearly 3 decades after the Rettendon murders, the infamous Blue Range Rover, where Pat Tate, Tony Tucker, and Craig Rolfe were executed, has resurfaced in the hands of a private collector. According to reports by the Daily Star, the vehicle is now being sold for an astonishing £100,000. Car collector Jake Hurst claims to own the 1988 Range Rover Vogue SE, and initially listed it for £15,000, admitting that the vehicle creeps him out and has an unpleasant odor inside. However, he later increased the asking price to £100,000. The vehicle, which was released by police in 1998 and has changed hands multiple times since, is currently listed as off-road, with its last MOT expiring in 2009. Despite the hefty price tag, Some skeptics doubt whether the car is truly the same one from the notorious Essex Boys murders. Hurst insists it is the real deal, claiming he keeps it in a yard with fake plates to prevent theft. Whether authentic or not, the vehicle remains a macabre piece of British crime history. Early in the investigation, London-based gangster Billy Jasper admitted to detectives he was the real killer's getaway driver. When he was arrested for armed robbery, he confessed to Met detectives that he was given £5,000 to drive a hitman, referred to only as Mr. D, to the murder scene. Jasper even gave evidence at the trial, asserting he was the real getaway driver, but was prevented by the judge from giving any names. The real mastermind behind the Rettendon murders was, according to Jasper, money launderer Patsy Bolt Eyes Clark, who laundered money from the infamous Brinks-Mat robbery, carried out in November 1983, during which £26 million worth of gold bullion, diamonds and cash was stolen from a warehouse operated by Brinks-Mat. One of those arrested over the heist was Patsy Clark, who in 1992 was jailed for 6 years for helping to launder £4.2 million of the proceeds from the Brinks-Mat robbery. According to Jasper, it was Clark who ordered the murder of Tony Tucker. Met Police DCI Dave McKelvey said they had the name of a major criminal, said to be behind the murder, the gunman, a credible motive and intelligence linking Tucker and money from the robbery. However, this line of inquiry was never seriously considered by investigators. DCI McKelvey added, they also had the account of a man claiming to be the getaway driver, but chose to dismiss what he said because it did not fit with their theory about whomson steal. Patsy Clark, a former scrap dealer and nightclub owner, was never questioned by police. Case 4. Craig Rolfe, a name synonymous with the infamous Essex Boys gang, remains an intriguing figure of mystery in the annals of British true crime. His life, marred by criminal activities and a violent end, paints a picture of the darker side of Essex's underworld in the mid-1990s. This article delves into the life of Craig Rolfe, exploring his rise in the criminal world and his crucial role in the Essex Boys drug gang. Craig Rolfe's notoriety in the criminal underworld is largely due to his involvement with the Essex Boys drug gang. This gang, known for its ruthless approach and control over the drug trade in Essex, saw Rolfe rise as a significant and important member of the gang. His activities were not limited to drug dealing, but included a range of criminal activities, earning him a reputation as a well-known figure in the Essex criminal underworld. Born in London's Holloway prison, Rolfe's criminal activities extended beyond the drug trade, and he became involved in various criminal acts that served to bolster his reputation. While detailed records of his crimes are limited, it is known that his influence in Essex's criminal underworld was substantial. His dealings often put him in the crosshairs of police attention, yet he always managed to evade significant legal repercussions for most of his criminal career. While much of Craig Rolfe's life was shrouded in the activities of the Essex Boys gang, there was another, more personal side to him. His relationship with Donna Jaggers, his long-term girlfriend, and their child, whom he left behind, reveals a different aspect of Rolfe. Donna Jaggers, who had been in a relationship with Rolfe for 7 years, was the mother of his child, just 6 years old at the time of the murders. Her emotional response to the tragedy, breaking down in tears in front of journalists, highlighted the profound personal loss behind the publicized criminal facade. The current whereabouts of Donna Jaggers are unknown. In her statement to police, Jaggers detailed Rolfe's involvement in drug dealing and weapons transactions, including the acquisition of a machine gun shortly before his death. After the murders, she discovered the gun in a holdall and eventually turned it over to authorities. Beyond her statement, little is publicly known about her life after the events surrounding the case. I am the girlfriend of Craig Rolfe and have known him for 15 years. We first met when I moved to Basildon with my parents. I started going out with Craig when I was 18, but that was quite a casual relationship. In 000088, just after my 19th birthday, we started a serious relationship, and soon after that I moved in with his parents at Basildon. I fell pregnant, and in 001289, I gave birth to our daughter Georgie. We had moved into a hostel, and were then given 105 spurriers laid on. During this time Craig was working on building sites doing dry lining. We then moved to 21 Bardfield, Vange, but I cannot be sure of dates or when this was. In 000394 Craig bought 8, Calshot Avenue, Chafford 100 Grays. The house at Bardfield was in my name, and I managed to swap this house through the council for my current address. The neighbors at Bardfield were very nosy, and I wanted to avoid problems due to the fact that I only went back there once a week to collect mail, etc. I took my current address with a view to buying it and then renting it out. My relationship with Craig was strong. He trusted me and told me most things that he was up to. In 000595, I had had enough of the drugs. He was using them himself and involved with them in dealing. I moved out of the Calshots address and went to my current address. After about 3 weeks, Craig came back and told me that he was going to make an effort to kick his drug habit. I knew instinctively that he meant this, and we went away on holiday to the Norfolk Broads for a week. When we came back, he had one lapse but stuck to it. Most weekends Craig used to go out, and I knew that he took smaller amounts of cocaine and used ecstasy, but not on the scale that he had been. I was aware that Craig's associates were Tony Tucker and Patrick Tate. During the mid to end of 001195, I was aware that they had something going on which, at this time, I am not willing to discuss. Craig told me that he was going to pick up a machine gun with a silencer and ammunition for their business. He told me that it was coming from a man I know as Mad Mick, who comes from London. I do know that this person is Mick Bowman. I asked Craig how much the gun was going to cost, and he told me that it was being borrowed and was going back to Bowman. About a week after Tony's birthday, which was 171,100, I went with Craig and others, who I do not want to name, to Hollywood's nightclub in Romford. Bowman was supposed to have met us in the Global Net Cafe beforehand, but he didn't turn up. I then met him through Craig in the nightclub. I recall thinking that he wasn't what I had expected. Craig had told me stories about him. He was with a girl who I only know as Debbie. About a week after this, I can be no more precise than this, Craig told me that we were going to meet Mick at the Thurrock Services to collect the gun. I went with Craig in the blue Range Rover, F424NP, to the services, and had something to eat in the Granada premises. I knew that we were supposed to meet Bowman about 1,300 hours, but he was about 10 minutes late. Craig went outside and returned shortly, and told me I was to go outside with them. When I got outside, I saw that Bowman was there with a white VW Corrado car, and there was another male with an old green Vauxhall Cavalier. Bowman was acting very paranoid, and I took it that he was on cocaine, and was acting hyper because of the situation with the gun. I am aware how people behave when they have taken cocaine, and that is how Bowman appeared to me. Bowman was trying to organize how they should drive off to a different location. Craig then suggested we should lead. The Cavalier should go in the middle, and then Bowman at the end. This only took a matter of minutes. Craig and I then got into the Range Rover and drove onto the A13 and traveled along to the Five Bells roundabout. We then came all the way around the Five Bells roundabout, and Craig pulled up onto the Eastern Garage's parking area. The Cavalier parked behind us, and Bowman parked the Coracle behind that. We all got out, and I started to walk away to stay out of the way. I saw a blue/gray holdall come out of the boot of the Cavalier and go into the boot of the Range Rover. The driver of the Cavalier was a small man about 5 feet 6 inches tall, early 20s or early 30s, of thin build. He had short cropped hair and wore glasses. I did not hear him speak. I am unable to say who took the holdall out of the Cavalier, but I believe Craig would probably have put it in the Range Rover, because he was impatient like that. Craig called me back to the car, and I got into the front of the Range Rover. I recall Bowman got into the back of the car and told Craig that he wanted the Range Rover once Craig had finished with it. Bowman then got out of the car, and Craig and I drove off, and went to Patrick Tate's bungalow in Gordon Road, Basildon. Craig had told me that Tate had spoken with the garage proprietor at Eastern Garages, a man called Barry Dorman, and told him that he had to buy Bowman's Corrado. I was aware that Bowman was going to stay behind at the garage and speak to Dorman about this. I recall seeing the two men walking towards one another when I was in the Range Rover. When we arrived outside Pat's house, Pat and Tony Tucker were sitting in Anna Whitehead's, Tucker's girlfriend, Suzuki Vitara. I cannot remember if Craig had spoken to them on his mobile phone prior to arriving at the house. Tony and Pat got out of the Vitara, and Craig took the holdall and gun from the boot, and all three went into the house. Sarah Saunders was at this time moving her stuff out of the house with the help of two friends. I didn't want to get involved in what was potentially a difficult situation, so I stayed in the car. Craig was in the house for about 10 to 15 minutes, and then returned to the car with the holdall and gun. He put the items back in the boot, and then drove to 108 Mill Green, where the gun and holdall were put into the loft. On the way from Gordon Road, Craig was saying how pleased they were with it, and how much damage it could cause. I did not see the gun at this time. A couple of days later, Craig picked me up from work and told me that Tony, Pat, and him had tested the gun. He stated that it was tested over at Tony's fobbing address in the field. He told me that he had cleaned it all and that he had put it back in the loft. He told me that he had cleaned his fingerprints off the gun, as I was concerned about this. The next thing that happened was that Craig, Tony, and Pat were found shot dead. I had a lot of things on my mind, but I realized the machine gun was a problem, but I knew the police didn't know about the Mill Green address, and I thought it would be safe to leave it here. During the Christmas period of 000095, Craig's brother moved my belongings from Chafford 100 to the Mill Green address. First thing after New Year 000096, I moved into Mill Green. I had only been in the house for a couple of days when I decided that I was going to have to do something about the gun. I spoke to Craig's mum about it, and she suggested that I took it round to her house. She was trying to get me to sort it out. I put the holdall on the dining room table, and I opened the bag. Until this point, I had not seen the gun. It was a dull silvery gray color. I only opened the top of the bag and did not see the silencer or ammunition. However, I believed they were in there because Craig had told me. I was now in a position where I had to make a decision as to what I was going to do about it. I left the gun in the bag and left it with Craig's mother. A couple of days later, I contacted D.I. Florence, who came to see me the next day. I only told him that I wanted to see him, but didn't tell him what it was about. About 11:45 on Thursday, 110196, D.I. Florence came to see me at Mill Green, and I told him about the gun at Craig's mother's house. I then took Mr. Florence to 158 Beam Bridge, Basildon, where I saw Craig's mother. I asked her where she had put the holdall. I then went to the shower room, which is on the ground floor, and put the holdall on the dining table for Mr. Florence to see. He asked if any of us had touched it, and he took it into his possession. At this time, this is all I can say about the gun. Referring back to the VW Corrado, I am aware that from talking to Craig that the vehicle was purchased by Eastern Garages, and I believe Bowman was given about £7,000. Craig told me that Bowman had paid about £10,000 for it. A pivotal aspect of Craig Rolfe's criminal life was his association with Tony Tucker and Pat Tate, fellow members of the Essex Boys gang. This trio formed a formidable and dangerous force in the underworld, with their names often mentioned together in hushed tones on the streets of Essex. Their partnership was not just professional, but also deeply personal, bound by a shared ambition and a ruthless approach to their criminal enterprises. He acted as a driver for his boss Tony Tucker, and was, according to his neighbors, a keen motorist who always had different cars on his drive as though he was a car dealer. There were rumors that he was involved with stealing cars and selling drugs, one said. One time I saw the police literally dismantling a car on his drive. According to neighbors, they had little contact with Rolfe and his family, who seemed quite secretive. They were rarely seen, one resident said. It was through his addiction to drugs that Rolfe became acquainted with the other Essex boys, who were heavily involved in dealing drugs. The Rettendon murders, a term that intrigues anyone familiar with Essex's criminal history, refer to the brutal killing of Craig Rolfe, Tony Tucker, and Pat Tate on December 6, 1995. This heinous crime occurred on a quiet country lane in Rettendon, marking a turning point in the history of organized crime in the area. The three men, well-known members of the Essex Boys gang, were found dead inside a Range Rover. The victims of a cold-blooded execution-style killing, each had been blasted by a shotgun at close range. Detectives believe the killer fired off 8 rounds and left the spent cartridges where they fell, with no desire to retrieve them. The 3 shots were fired off in quick succession, hitting Rolfe first, then Tucker. It was surmised that before he could react, Tate was shot in the abdomen. The gunman then reloaded the shotgun, before shooting him twice in the head, and for good measure then fired another shot each into the already dead Tucker and Rolfe. Craig Rolfe had been taken by surprise, as both his hands were still on the steering wheel and his foot still pressed on the brake. There was a 2-inch round entry wound behind his ear that exited out through his mouth, and blood seeped out of the car. Detective Superintendent Ivan Dibley, who was leading the Rettendon murder investigation, believed Tate was the target. The others were merely collateral damage. The gruesome discovery of their bodies was made the following morning by local farmers, who found their blood-spattered Range Rover. The sight of the lifeless victims, slumped inside the vehicle, sent shockwaves through the community, and saw the start of one of the most extensive murder investigations in Essex's history. A newspaper article covering Craig Rolfe made mention of the funeral of drug baron Craig Rolfe, shot dead in a gangland ambush at Rettendon, was held yesterday. A cortege of 20 cars followed a horse-drawn carriage carrying the coffin from his mother's house in Beambridge, Pitsea, to St. Gabriel's and on to the cemetery. Mourners heard the Rev. Laurie Blaney say words by Rolfe's partner Donna Jaggers, 26, and his mother Lorraine. Rolfe, 26, of Chafford Hundred, was shot in a Range Rover on a remote track on December 6. The funerals of Patrick Tate, 37, of Gordon Road, Basildon, and Anthony Tucker, 38, of Fobbing, murdered with him, were taking place today. Several theories have surfaced regarding the motive behind these murders. Some suggest their deaths were related to the drug underworld in which they operated, others point to internal gang rivalries, and a few even link the killings to the death of Leah Betts, a young girl who died after taking an ecstasy tablet rumored to have been supplied by the Essex Boys. Despite extensive speculation, the true motive behind these murders remains a subject of debate and mystery. The investigation into the Rettendon murders was both complex and extensive, involving numerous police resources. In January 1998, after more than 2 years of working the case, police arrested Jack Hooms and Michael Steele, who were later convicted for the 3 murders. This conviction was largely based on the testimony of police informant Darren Nichols, who was a former associate of the accused. Operation Century, conducted by Essex Police with assistance from the Royal Ulster Constabulary Special Branch, RUC, was a high-stakes sting operation focused on the infamous Rettendon murders involving Craig Rolfe and 2 other members of the Essex Boys gang. Initiated in response to these brutal killings in December 1995, this operation sought to apply pressure on individuals suspected of having knowledge about the murders, in an effort to gather evidence and incriminate the culprits. Tactics and controversies. The operation, however, was marred by controversies and questionable tactics. Essex Police, under the pretext of the renewed Irish Republican bombing campaign, including the 1996 Docklands bombing, employed intimidating and threatening strategies. Undercover officers made harassing phone calls to the suspects and their families, posing as Republican drug runners from Belfast. These calls involved foul language and threats, which in some cases could be construed as death threats. One particularly affected individual was Donna Jaggers, the girlfriend of Craig Rolfe, who was misled to believe that these terror tactics were being employed by Belfast-based Republicans. She turned to Essex Police for assistance, unaware that the police themselves were behind these calls. The impact of these tactics on Jaggers and other victims, already grieving and distraught, was profound and deeply criticized. The methods used in Operation Century were eventually deemed illegal and counterproductive. During the trial for the Rettendon murders, tape recordings of the threatening police phone calls were presented in court, revealing the increasing threats as the operation unraveled. The suspects did not believe the undercover officers' claims of Belfast Republicans funding Essex criminal activities, leading to the operation's failure. This operation drew significant media attention and criticism, particularly for its senior officer, Detective Superintendent Ivan Dibley. Comparisons were made to a previous controversial undercover operation, Operation Edsel, which involved the Rachel Nichol murder case. The tactics used in Operation Century, like those in Edsel, were criticized for their ethical breaches and inefficacy. Operation Century remains a contentious chapter in the investigation of the Rettendon murders, illustrating the complexities and ethical challenges faced in high-profile criminal investigations. The operation's tactics, though intended to solve a heinous crime, crossed legal and ethical boundaries, affecting the lives of those connected to the case and stirring debate within law enforcement and the public. Hooms and Steele were sentenced to life imprisonment after a trial at the Old Bailey. However, the reliability of the evidence, particularly mobile phone records used to corroborate the informant's testimony, was called into question. Over the next 2 decades, both men challenged their convictions, albeit unsuccessfully. In a significant development, Jack Hooms was released from prison on license in January 2021 after serving 23 years. His sentence was reduced by 2 years in 2018 due to his exemplary conduct while incarcerated. Craig Rolfe's legacy extends beyond his life and the infamous Rettendon murders. His story has inspired several crime dramas and documentaries, reflecting the enduring fascination with the Essex Boys saga. Films like Essex Boys, 2000, Rise of the Foot Soldier, 2007, and Bonded by Blood, 2010, draw inspiration from the events surrounding Rolfe and his associates. These portrayals have kept the memory of the Rettendon murders alive in popular culture, illustrating the ongoing interest in this dark chapter of Essex's history. Craig Rolfe's journey from an obscure figure in Essex to a central character in one of the most notorious crime stories in British history is both compelling and cautionary. His life, marked by criminal exploits and a tragic end, offers a glimpse into the complexities of the criminal underworld. The Rettendon murders, his involvement in the Essex Boys gang, and the impact on his family and community continue to fascinate and horrify in equal measure. Case 5. On November 11, 1995, a young woman named Leah Betts was admitted to hospital for a suspected drug overdose. That evening she had been out celebrating her 18th birthday with friends at an Essex nightclub, where it was alleged she had taken an ecstasy tablet. 5 days later, Leah Betts died from the effects of the drug, which was used by the British tabloid media as an example of the dangers of drugs. For many young people turning 18, a night out drinking and partying is seen as a rite of passage, that final journey from childhood to adulthood. From that point onwards, they can legally buy items and do things that were once forbidden. For Leah Betts, it was meant to be a happy event, but her celebrations soon turned tragic. Just 10 days after her 18th birthday, Leah Betts, a schoolgirl from Latchington in Essex, decided to go partying with friends at one of the many nightclubs in the area. At some point in the evening, the group of friends went to Raquel's club, where one of them bought a bag of ecstasy, MDMA, tablets from a dealer that were stamped with an apple symbol. It is unknown who provided a tablet to Leah Betts, but 4 hours after taking one, and after drinking approximately 7 liters of water during a 90-minute period. This was following common advice at the time to drink more fluids after taking an excessive dancing post-drug that could lead to dehydration, which in turn exacerbating her hyponatremia, a symptom known as SIADH. As a result, Leah began drinking an unsafe amount of water. With the drug affecting her bodily systems, she felt unwell and was taken to Broomfield Hospital in Chelmsford, where she would remain until she died, just 5 days later when the life support machine keeping her alive was turned off. This decision was taken by her family, who were told she would not recover from the effects of the drugs she ingested. A post-mortem found that because of the drug's effects of her bodily functions, she was unable to relieve herself after drinking so much water. As a result, she suffered water intoxication and hyponatremia, which led to her brain swelling. This is what caused her to fall into a coma, from which she never recovered. Sat at her bedside was her father Paul Betts, an ex-policeman, her stepmother and her brother William, who was 7 years younger. Look what can happen when young people don't listen. One tablet could end her life. What sort of a buzz is that, for God's sake? She's 18, said Paul. I don't know whether she is going to see 19. At the inquest, it was stated by toxicologist John Henry, who had previously warned the public of the danger of MDMA causing death by dehydration. If Leah had taken the drug alone, she might well have survived. If she had drunk the amount of water alone, she would have survived. The death of Leah Betts was a direct result of the ecstasy, MDMA, tablet she was supplied and had taken, and so Essex police launched a large inquiry to locate the suppliers of the tablet she had taken. A team of 35 officers were able to pinpoint Raquel's club as the venue where it was bought. Detectives arrested and charged 4 of her friends who had been present at the house as a result of the investigation. Of these 4, only 2 were prosecuted. 1 received a conditional discharge, while the other was acquitted after a retrial. The identity of the dealer remained a mystery, as did the group behind the supply of drugs, with the whole investigation cost roughly £300,000. The death of Leah Betts caused fear and shock across Britain, with many parents worried about dangers such drugs posed to their children. Leah was a young woman from a middle-class family, who, it was believed, had never done drugs before. The British press used the incident as a prime example of the dangers of drug use. Every so often an event occurs which shocks us out of our apathy. The tragedy of Leah Betts is such an event, Liverpool Echo journalist Walter Huntley said at the time. Police confirmed that the drug Leah had taken was not contaminated, and that she had died from the effects of the drug on its own. 1 month after the tragic death of Leah Betts, the bodies of 3 men were found inside a Range Rover on a quiet country lane in Rettendon. The victims, who had been shot to death inside the vehicle, were later identified as local drug dealers Tony Tucker, Pat Tate and Craig Rolfe, who were known as the Essex Boys. It soon became reported in the press that Tucker's gang had been responsible for the control of drugs in Raquel's club, the Basildon nightclub where the ecstasy tablet that caused Leah Betts' death had been bought. This in turn led to the theory that the murders of the Essex boys was in retaliation for her death. The father of Leah Betts, a retired Met firearms officer, was even pulled in for questioning over the shootings. Paul Betts said, "I nearly got nicked for the murders. At the time I was running a clay pigeon shooting business, and the police took all my guns. But I hadn't heard of any of the murdered three." Despite this theory, there was never any evidence that linked the three murdered drug dealers to the supply of drugs that caused Leah Betts' death. The murder of the Essex boys was later attributed to an underworld feud that caused a fallout between Tony Tucker, Pat Tate, and Craig Rolfe, and two associates who were later convicted of their murders. An anti-drug campaign featured a picture of Leah Betts smiling, with the caption sorted, "Just one ecstasy tablet took Leah Betts." A haunting image of Leah Betts on life support in her hospital bed that was released by her family has become one of the defining images of the dangers of drug use in Britain. Case 6. Many people throughout the world enjoy following their favorite celebrities, with some even wishing they could meet them someday. Then there are people who hold more than just a passing interest and would want to pursue a relationship. One of those people believed she had fulfilled this dream when she entered into a relationship with a Hollywood actor. Sadly, it turned out that unscrupulous scammers had deceived the poor woman out of $850,000 with a Brad Pitt scam. Online scammers have been around for as long as the internet itself. They pose as someone in need, hoping their victim will send them money. Romance scams are even more insidious when they prey on the lonely and desperate. In the U.S. alone, more than 64,000 Americans were scammed out of a total of over $1 billion in 2023. This was double the $500 million just 4 years earlier. On January 12, 2025, French broadcaster TF1 aired a program about a woman who reportedly believed she had been in a committed relationship with Hollywood actor Brad Pitt for a year and a half. When the story attracted national attention, the broadcaster withdrew it after the victim began receiving mockery from online social media posters. The 7 to 8 program gave details about the scam, in which the victim, 53-year-old interior designer Anne, had lost her life savings and tried to take her